Last week, Speaker McCarthy gave a big speech unveiling House Republicans' quote, clear plan, end quote, to address the debt. And I thought we would finally be getting some specifics about what House Republicans think we should cut. After all, President Biden released his budget almost 2 months ago, and his budget was actually incredibly detailed. And it laid out proposals for spending in 2024. The president's budget would cut taxes for families and American workers by restoring the full child tax credit that Mr. Lauro has championed and making the earned income tax credit permanent. He talked about reducing prescription drug costs, including by capping the price of insulin at $35 a month for everybody. And let's talk about that for a moment. Democrats already put this $35 insulin cap in place for senior citizens. It is now the law, and folks on Medicare cannot be charged more than $35 a month for their life-saving insulin. Does anyone know Does anyone know what that law is? I mean, it's the Inflation Reduction Act that was contained in. The same law that you guys want to repeal. So let me continue. The president's budget would also improve college affordability by increasing the size of Pell Grants. It would keep our kids from going hungry by enabling schools to provide healthy, free meals. It would extend the solvency of Medicare by at least 25 years. It would provide almost $21 billion to implement the CHIPS and Science Act that we passed this year. And it would do all of that while reducing deficits by nearly $3 trillion. So we know what the president's plan is. I mean, he put it out there in great detail. We know who it is intended to help. Now, contrast that with the bill that we're considering here today. There are no fine details about where these cuts would come from or how they would impact American families. That's because the Republican leadership doesn't want to talk about where the cuts will come from. And that's why the bill doesn't explicitly state that critical programs like Meals on Wheels and the WIC program will have to be slashed to make their math work. Now, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, and I said at the beginning, has not only said he won't go along with any cuts to defense spending, he said that he expects substantial defense increases. And my good friend Chairman Cole, and I don't want to misquote him, but I think he's reported as saying, we're not going to cut defense. I just promise you that, and I suspect we will increase it, end quote. So we're being told that the Pentagon cannot save a single dollar and the wealthy can't pay another dime, but don't worry, we will slash the deficit by taking resources from everyone else. And we're supposed to believe that nobody will get hurt. So if cuts to our defense programs and veterans' medical care are off the table, as many Republicans have claimed, and by the way, I think that cuts to veterans' medical care should be off the table, this bill will require cutting non-defense discretionary programs by at least 22%. 22%. That would be absolutely devastating for millions of American families. For example, it would mean that nutrition services, such as Meals on Wheels, would be cut for more than 1 million seniors. 2 million vulnerable individuals and families, including rural and underserved populations, would lose access to health care services. And the Social Security Administration would be forced to close field offices, and some applicants would wait an additional 2 months for processing claims. So here's my question for Chairman Arrington. Specifically, what programs will Republicans actually cut to save trillions of dollars?
You bet. I laid that out in the presentation. The student loan bailout, which is $500 billion that the president unilaterally executed. I think it's unconstitutional. Probably the courts will overrule him. We've got unspent COVID monies that 2 years later, tens of billions of dollars. You've got mandatory spending reforms like the Bill Clinton era common sense welfare to work reforms. That would reduce the deficit. So there's a number, and then you've got the discretionary piece where we basically go back 4 months. CBO said we'd be spending $330 billion less than we're spending today in 2019.
Well, so let me ask you specifically. The administration has warned that cuts at these levels, 22% non-defense discretionary funding we're talking about here, but that the administration warned that cuts at these levels would cause over 1 million of our seniors to stop receiving Meals on Wheels. Do you support cutting Meals on Wheels for over 1 million of our seniors?
The vulnerable populations and veterans will not have to have any interruption in their funding. But there's a long list and a boatload of climate-related. There's a lot of expansion of government-controlled health care. You've got a $27 billion EPA slush fund. I could be here for hours.
But we're doing a 22% across the board minimum cut. And we don't know if we raise defense spending, that might be more. The acting Social Security Administrator says cuts this severe would significantly affect their ability to serve the public. Do you support forcing the Social Security Administration to close dozens of field offices and have longer wait times when Americans call for help?
I support the reasonable and responsible reining in of an oversized bureaucracy that has come through COVID and is now, by all measures, including Obama's budget, in his last year, he said we'd be spending at 22 levels. That we're going back to Obama's budget.
Well, the Social Security Administration was not created during COVID. So, and I'm reporting to you figures that they have provided us. The Department of Homeland Security says that under these budget levels, they would have to reduce their air and marine patrol operations by over half. They say this plan would lead to hundreds of pounds more of fentanyl illegally getting into the U.S. every year. I can't believe you support that.
I don't, but the president does, because in his budget that he just submitted to our committee, and we had 2 oversight hearings, he reduces Homeland Security funding by $600 million.
Yeah. Well, you're going to cut it by 22%.
He pluses up EPA by 1,200 full-time employees.
Secretary Fudge says that 640,000 families would lose their rental assistance under a 22% cut. Do you support making our seniors homeless by cutting housing choice vouchers that they rely on?
This is, to me, predictable rhetoric that you would suggest that any cut would have to come from a vulnerable population or a veteran, and you've listed all of them. And it's stunning that you all could be so consistent in the list of people that you think will bear the brunt of these cuts. And I would suggest to you, with all due respect, Mr. Governor, there is a lot of waste, there is a lot of woke, and there is a lot of bloat in this government, and we got to get to cutting and reducing it, and we don't have to impede on or disrupt any funding for the folks that you are listing.
The Department of Justice said that these cuts would lead to the elimination of 11,000 FBI personnel. Secretary Buttigieg says that these cuts would lead to 11,000 fewer days of rail inspection and 30,000 fewer miles of inspected track. Secretary Cardona says a 22% cut will mean no funding through their state and local grant programs for over 100,000 teachers nationwide. Secretary Vilsack says that cuts this severe would take food away from over 1 million women, infant, and children. I hope you don't support any of these things, but these were requests anticipating what you were going to come up with here today, to ask specifically if you had to get a 22% cut. And by the way, these aren't the only things that are going to be cut, right? So what we're hearing today is that my Republican friends want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say they're for making huge budget cuts, but also claim that popular programs won't be cut. The simple truth is that cuts of this magnitude are impossible to make without hurting the American people. It is frankly irresponsible and cruel. You can't. This is about arithmetic, right?